A warmer friendly hello, welcome to lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast with myself, Craig Peterson, now part of the VC Family Podcast. We've got an excellent podcast for you. We're going to be keeping this 1 to 2 parts, and moving forward, we're probably going to be having quite a few 2-part conversations and podcasts here in the offseason as transfer portal is starting to wind down a little bit more, and that's one of the main topics that we're going to be talking about with our guest in segment number 2, Kevin Sweeney, who does amazing work over at SI. Now, we're going to be chatting with him about where some of these teams go that have yet to be able to fill all their needs in the transfer portal, just how the portal is playing out, and he's going to pose to us the fact that the real, I guess you call it anti-air quotes here, desperate period in the transfer portal was about a week or two ago, how a lot of these teams are trying to build a little bit more chemistry as well. Something else I'll be talking about is that we've seen it in the past few off seasons, more moves made in like July, August, why a lot of these teams are both deciding to and sort of having it taken out of their hands that they're not going to be picking up as many guys here in July and August as well. Certainly, we've got the aftermath of everything that happened with Danny Hurley staying at UConn. Going to be chatting with them about what to expect out of UConn, what this means for the Big East, what this means for college basketball as well. So, got a lot to chat about with our good friend in Kevin in segment number 2. And then here in this segment, just going to give you guys a little bit of an overlay as to how we're going to be proceeding moving forward with regards to conference previews, which I held off a little bit on those. Typically, I start those up more around the first week of June with all the Dan Hurley news breaking out. I did wait just a touch on these this off season, but those are going to be starting up in the next few days, and I do really want you guys to send in these Twitter/X questions. That way I know what you guys want to hear moving forward here on the first segment of the show. If you do have something that you want me to riff about, if you've got a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of 2 ways to be able to fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at GNet_1. Keep in mind, letters EM, they mean does not matter, so as per usual, please send these into the timeline. Other ways, find an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire on whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And in terms of those conference previews I was alluding to a little bit before, going to be starting those up this weekend. First one will probably be up either Saturday, maybe at the latest Sunday, but I always do this the same way I always do the order. I go with the smaller conferences first in alphabetical order, like this week you're going to be getting the Atlantic Sun and the America East. And then we go with the B's next week with like the Big Sky, Big South. Might go Big West over Big South. Sometimes it's based on guest availability, so sometimes I'll mix it around a little bit there, but it's not like we're going to be going with like the West Coast Conference next week or anything like that. Do not worry there. It's probably going to be one of the killer bees in terms of that, but that's the way that we're going to be proceeding moving forward. For those of you guys that have listened to this podcast in the past, you know that I break down every single one of those teams, give my projected order finish, look at some of the conference trends that we do find as well, because every conference, it is a little bit different. Some of it is based on officiating. Some of it is just based on the style of teams. Like, I still go back to when Stephen F. Austin was in the Southland many, many years ago. So many teams tried to emulate Stephen F. Austin the way that they were able to grab turnovers, and now you got a Southland Conference that even with them out still has a bunch of teams that they're looking to generate turnovers. They play that amoeba zone, what have you. So I do think that that is very important to be doing, but those are going to be getting started within the next few days because, well, we are starting to get to that point where these rosters are becoming solidified. Though we still do have a few moves that are being made in the transfer portal, and we really only saw one notable move made in college basketball on Tuesday, so we'll go through that. Dontaie Allen, he has decided that he is going to be going to Wyoming, and credit to Sundance Wicks and the job that he has been able to do over at Wyoming thus far, because he took this job a little bit on the fly. Jeff Linder decided to become an assistant over at Texas Tech about, I would say, a month ago, maybe a tad bit more, maybe a tad bit less. He was able to retain some of the guys that were supposed to be coming in with Jeff Linder, Tuki Tanamo, a double-figure scorer over at Denver, along with the 2 Yamanachi Williams. They were coming back. He really needed that sort of a wing scorer, and I do think that Dontaie Allen does a good job of being able to fill that void. Last year, he was over at Western Kentucky. He was logging 8 points, shot 40% from three-point range out there in Conference USA. Still do think that's probably going to be a little bit of a rough year for Wyoming in general, but that said, bringing in a guy like a Dontaie Allen, I think is big. And Sundance Wicks, we saw what he was able to do with UW Green Bay in his 1 year there. far, UW Green Bay was the laughingstock of the Horizon League. They rise up into the upper echelon of that conference, and being able to bring in the talent that he has, been very, very impressed. Again, please do send in those Twitter/X questions. That way I know what you guys want to be hearing a little bit more on, as I know that the buzz of college basketball thus far in the last week or so has been on UConn, so we're going to be talking about that next with Kevin Sweeney. But on top of that, just why teams are not waiting as long in the transfer portal. If there is any players other than Coleman Hawkins that may be impact guys are remaining out there in the transfer portal as well, and just the state of college basketball with Mr. Hurley returning to UConn. That's up next right here on Coach Gibson with myself, Craig Peterson, now a part of the Beast and Family Podcast. And we're back in lovely Las Vegas for Coast to Coast Hoops with myself, Craig Peterson, now part of the Beast and Family Podcast, and it is always great to be joined by this man, as Kevin Sweeney. He does such a tremendous job taking a look at this great game of college basketball. I know that he's very much looking at the NBA draft right now, but he, much like all of us, were on Danny Hurley watch the last week or so over at SI now. He does a tremendous job on that front. He is based out there in the Midwest, and being someone from the great state of Wisconsin, absolutely love folks out there in the great Midwest. You're able to follow Kevin on Twitter/X at CBB_Central all together. And Kevin, it's always a pleasure, my friend. Thank you.
Appreciate you, man. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for joining me, Kevin. And Kevin, let's talk about what has been the biggest story of the week, because my goodness gracious, we've got Noah Williams heading on over to James Madison, which, I mean, hey, that is a big thing for them. James Madison, nice kit there with Noah Williams. But as we know, a little bit bigger than that, Danny Hurley, he decides to turn down the Lakers job. He's going to be heading back to UConn. And for one, just what does this mean for college basketball? Because I feel like you've done a lot of this, much like myself. You hear these people are saying, oh, college basketball is dying. It's a bad product and everything like that. And yet always it feels like college basketball is winning out while all its competitors that are having a little bit of a rough time of it. And two, just what it means for the Big East in general, because UConn, ever since they have rejoined the Big East, have really been able to overrun that conference over the last few years.
Yeah, look, like if you're going to say that it would have been bad for college basketball for Hurley to leave, which I 100% agree with, you have to say it's a boon for the sport to get him back, which is the reality of this, right? I think, look, Dan Hurley's emergence at UConn over the last 2 years came at a great time because it was right at the point where, I think really it was a game in transition with all the, big name coaches, with Coach K, Roy Williams, Jay Wright, all leaving the game. The sport was kind of starved for a coaching star, right? This is a game that is maybe more focused on its coaches than its players. The players move so much year to year. They change. Like the coaching talent is so important, and Hurley has become the face of college basketball. There's zero question about that. The personality, the winning, the style of play, like everything about it is phenomenal. Yeah, obviously huge to keep him. I think we'll go through this again. This will not be the last time that we're talking about, Dan Hurley getting NBA interest, but every year we keep him is a good year, and certainly excited to have him back. As for the Big East, you're certainly important, not just for, the league's strength, kind of 1 through 11, but also I think, for its future, right? This is a conference that its TV deal is up after next season, to have, the face of the sport coaching in that conference, to have 4 of the last 8 national champions in that conference, it's pretty special. And I think it gives the league substantial bargaining power as it heads into a significant TV deal that will shape its future in the revenue sharing era.
No question about it. And maybe I'm making a little bit too much of this. Maybe I'm diving a little bit too deep into it. But I just think of what we've seen in college basketball over the last few years, as the last team really on the West Coast to win a national title was Arizona in 1997. As we know, there's a lot of great schools out there in California, but how much do you think that these schools out there in California have perhaps lost out a little bit on some of this talent in the NIL era in terms of some of these great coaches? Because the Lakers certainly lost out on this, in my opinion, just because the tax bracket out there in the state of California, much greater than it was going to be if you would have stayed at UConn, because I thought that the Lakers were going to need to offer more than what they did. And when you do all the math, it's not like Danny Hurley is taking as much of a pay cut as it would look like on paper with the $20 million differential with UConn offering 50 and the Lakers offering 70.
Yeah, look, there's a lot of factors. And I don't think it was just money, but you can't be helping, right? And again, not to say that like the governor of California is going to listen to the basketball podcast and start reshaping how he wants to make decisions. Like that's obviously not likely. But look, the taxes are what they are, and it's one of the many things that guys have to consider. I think for Danny is, more so it was the fit and the timing. The Knicks is really the job that he covets. We'll see if that becomes a reality for him in the future. Timing was hard for him. trying to walk away after the 2 championships. Like, I think if this happened in 2026 or 2027, a couple years removed from the back-to-back titles, once he feels like maybe he stagnated a little bit in college, I think it's a different conversation. But just a really, really hard thing to walk away from where he has that program right now. And it had to be the perfect situation. And for a variety of reasons, the Lakers' job just wasn't that.
Totally agree with you there. And certainly with regards to Danny Hurley, if it would have been after they had lost to New Mexico State a few years ago in the NCAA tournament, you might be staring at something different rather than trying to three-peat for the first time in many, many decades in college basketball. As Kevin Sweeney does great work over at SI Now. He is joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And as we know, Kevin, biggest news in college basketball over the last few weeks has been Danny Hurley, the fact that he does decide that he is going to be returning to UConn. But we have seen a few moves that have been a little bit under the radar over the last few weeks. And I was talking about the landscape of the Big East. And I do think that the Big East in general has had a nice last few weeks because I've had my concerns with Villanova, them bringing in Whoopa Poplar. I don't think it's going to make them quite like a top 25 team or anything like that, but that certainly does help them out because I was very bearish on them prior to that move. Xavier, all the pieces that they've been able to bring back with Zach Freemantle coming back in the fold, I think that that's big. And I feel like over the last few weeks, the conference that has really been winning the most, certainly headlined with the Danny Hurley news, has been the Big East.
Yeah, 100%. Like, I think it's a good spring for the league. You can really highlight something at every school, right? DePaul became more competent with Chris Holtmann on the job. Providence had a big spring and kept Bryce Hopkins. St. John's got arguably the 2 best point guards in the portal in Davion Smith and Kadari Richmond. Seton Hall, a group that really struggles from like an NIL standpoint, still trying to catch up there. They had a nice finish and have gotten much more athletic and deeper than they've been. Found some good mid-major pieces. Added Garway Duel from Providence, who's a big talent, a guy who has a chance to play in the NBA at some point in his career. So I think overall, like, a lot to like with the league. Villanova, a lot of questions to answer still, could use another piece, but Whoopa Poplar is a pretty substantial addition to that backcourt. Gives him a guy who can create his own shot, a guy who's played in big games, right? An Elite Eight in the Final Four early in his career. Him and Eric Dixon, that's a little bit of a nucleus you can build around, and then complement him with guys like Tyler Perkins from Penn and Jameer Brickus from LaSalle, who obviously have experience in Philly. Brickus has played at a high level in the Atlantic 10. Perkins, one of the best freshmen in the Ivy League. So I think it's easy to talk yourself into a lot of teams this time of year because, especially nowadays, everybody hits the portal. You could talk yourself into why those portal guys will be good. It takes, all those guys hitting their potential and also meshing together for it to work. But I think you can look at pretty much every Big East roster other than potentially DePaul and Georgetown and talk yourself into why they could be a tournament team. And if you're the league, that's all you can really ask for.
And I'm so glad that you mentioned what you did at the end because right now, what we're all taking a look at in college basketball is that there's a lot of people that they're so bullish on these transfer portal moves, and rightfully so. Like Kansas, I thought, did a really good job in the portal. Bringing in someone like a Cliff Omoruyi for Alabama, that's big. And they brought back Mark Sears as well, which I thought that was massive. The NBA draft decisions, they went their way. But how much do you want to take a look at some of these teams that maybe they're not creating a whole lot of buzz with what they're bringing back in the transfer portal, but one team out there in the Big East and Marquette that really never hits a transfer portal, they return much of what they had last season, sans Tyler Kolek. And then I take a look at a team like Gonzaga as well, and they certainly have added a few pieces in the portal as well. But what I really love about those two teams is what they have coming back, not necessarily what they have coming in.
Yeah, look, I think it's really hard to be elite in college basketball just on retention right now because, you're really, really relying on guys taking substantial steps from role players to stars, right? So if you're Marquette, I think the floor is really high, but, do they have enough to be pushing UConn for the Big East championship this year after losing 2 NBA players? Maybe not, right? But you need to retain a core. It is really, really hard to go in the portal unless you have unlimited money to spend and go get a full starting 5 every spring. You need to be able to mix that retention and, high-level transfers and good freshmen that you can develop over multiple years. You want transfers who can play multiple years in your program. We've seen the success of those second-year transfers. Devin Carter at Providence this past year, a good example. Tristan Newton, obviously at UConn, going from good to Bob Cousy Award winner. So, yeah, I think Gonzaga is honestly a great model, right? This is a group that has a couple of second-year transfers in Nembhard and Graham Ike, who are huge parts of a very good Sweet 16 level team this past year. You've got role players who have a chance to continue to grow, like Ben Gregg. Nolan Hickman made the jump last year. Does he have another one in him? And then you supplement that in the portal, both short and long term. You get short-term pieces like Michael Ajayi from Pepperdine, who averaged 17 and 10. Caleb Battle from Arkansas, who averaged almost 15 points a game. Guys who had proven production, scoring, experience, versatility, and then some longer term plays with Braden Smith, the Colgate transfer, who I think will redshirt his first year at Gonzaga, but might be starting point guard in 25-26, and Emmanuel Incenti as well from Tarleton, who was, WAC Defensive Player of the Year, I believe, all rookie team in that league. Like, that's a really, really nice balance to strike, where you're getting the freshmen in, you're getting the transfers, you're retaining key pieces, and you're opening up these kind of championship windows. And I think Gonzaga is certainly in that conversation this year as a group that can win a national championship.
Very glad that you mentioned Braden Smith there as well, because I thought that was so big. Being able to have a guy redshirt for a year, be able to learn a little bit, and then you're able to plug him in. We've actually seen Gonzaga prior to really the no sit-outs for transfers that came about 4 or 5 years ago. They were masters at that, like a Kyle Wilcher, for example, quite a few years ago. He sat out a year, and then boom, he became a big part of that team. And was able to make the Final Four and the national title game. As joining me on the show, we've got Kevin Sweeney, does great work over at SI Now, joining me right here on Coast to Coast Hoops. And Kevin, we both know this. In terms of the transfer portal, the pickings are getting a little bit more slim. Coleman Hawkins is out there, but past that, there's a little bit less buzz. And how do you look at some of these teams right now that there are still quite a few out there that they would love nothing more than to be able to bring in a role player, a starter or two, because it just feels like the law of supply and demand right now. If you're one of those few guys that are still remaining out there in the portal, there should be a lot of demand for your services, because it does feel like there's a lot of teams looking to fill out those rosters, and I feel like the options have just really dwindled over the last few weeks.
Yeah, it's certainly slim. There's a few other guys out there, that guys who are either top recruits who haven't panned out, or, some guys who are just lingering. Arthur Kaluma would be one of those. David Coate from Northern Illinois is a guy, I think will get some interest here late. But yeah, without question, I do think it's a little bit more balanced now in terms of the market than it was maybe on June 1st or late in May, because quite frankly, there's just not a lot of spots out there anymore, right? Like, the peak desperation came when the portal numbers had dwindled to, there's only a handful of good players at each position left, and almost everyone still needs, we need a backup center, we need a starting point guard, we need this, that, the other thing. Now, I think one of the things you're seeing with the Coleman Hawkins sweepstakes is, the number of schools that have the money to pay him what he believes he's worth, the role where he can be a starter, and the willingness to roll the dice on a, complete culture changer in mid-June, right? Like, completely reshape how they're building their team right as you're starting summer practice. Like, those options are few and far between. So there is a sweet spot. The market does sort of ebb and flow. There are guys out there, if teams are looking to fill out their benches, whether those be reclassified 2025 recruits into 2024. I know that's one name to watch there is Will Riley, 5-star recruit in 2025, who seems likely headed to Illinois, but nothing done yet. International market, obviously a big deal. We've seen some big names come off the board there, like Demon at BYU and Kesparis Jakashunas at Illinois. We'll see a few more of those here over the next weeks and months. But without question, like, there's very few starting spots available right now in the portal and just in general, right? There's not a lot of gaping holes on rosters. And so teams have to be selective, but there are still enough talented guys out there that will have to find homes, that we'll see how they start reshaping teams.
Piggybacking off of that a little bit as well, I'm not sure if you've noticed the same thing I have, but it feels like teams didn't wait as long in the transfer portal this year as in past years. And I've noticed in past years, some of these teams that they wait until July, even in the case of like at Kansas State, sometimes even early August to bring in some of these guys. It just felt like the chemistry with those teams was a little bit off. How much do you think that teams maybe made it a little bit more of a point to get their rosters solidified by late May, early June this year, as opposed to last year? Because I just look at those teams that waited in past years, and it just felt like they were behind the 8 ball.
Yeah, look, I think no one wants to be in that spot. If you can be aggressive, you're going to. Certainly another factor in that is, like, the schools that went through that last year probably felt like they got leveraged a lot financially. When there is limited supply and there's still a lot of demand, you're going to have to pay top dollar for some of these guys. And so I think when you do that, you probably learn from it and you say, all right, like, what can we do next year to avoid being in that same position? And how can we be a little bit more aggressive and heat guys up so we're making decisions earlier in the cycle? I do think the last kind of element of this is just a rule change with the grad transfers. Last year, May, June, July, even into August, you could basically poach guys into the portal who had graduated and convince kids who weren't going to transfer originally to decide to transfer now and take that spot. And now, because the grad transfer rule got moved with the portal to the same date as the regular portal close date of May 1st, or, whichever limited exceptions with coaching changes, the supply, I think, has dwindled a little bit. And you think about the moves that have been made late, like what you mentioned with K-State and Memphis. I mean, those two schools were doing it with grad transfers. Keontae Johnson a couple years ago from Florida to K-State. Memphis last year with Javon Quinterly. So it's a bit of a different world now without that rule. I think it's good. I think it creates a little less chaos. And it's good to have teams on campuses. Like, coaches want to have a summer where they can work out with guys and get better. The more time the guys can have together with one another, the better.
Yep, absolutely, especially with those guards, because I do feel like a forward can come into the program a little bit late and not miss a ton when you're a guard trying to build that chemistry, like we were seeing with Javon Quinterly over at Memphis, Tyler Perry this last year over at Kansas State. That did very much hurt them, but what always helps us is being able to get you on this show, Kevin, because you do an absolutely tremendous job. Take a look at this great game that we all know and love of college basketball. Love to get people at home know it's all on tap for you, and how people are able to follow along on social media and other platforms.
Twitter still at CBB_Central. All the written work over at Sports Illustrated. Have a feature up here this week about Jared McCain, the Duke star freshman who's off to the NBA, and I think will be a really, really good pro. And obviously flowing into the offseason, but still lots of stuff to dive into in June and July. And then before we know it, it'll be preview season. So start heating up that and doing some of the work behind the scenes to get that ready.
Yes, preview season is coming upon us. It is getting here as these rosters are becoming solidified. Kevin, he does an absolutely tremendous job taking a look at this wonderful game. And every single time he joins this show makes us all smarter. So big thanks to Kevin for joining me on Coast to Coast Hoops. Now part of the VSiN family of podcasts, and if you do like hearing from this fine podcast, Coast to Coast Hoops, you're able to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. If you have a question, comment, segment idea, what have you for this podcast, you have one of two ways we'll fire those in. First one is my Twitter/X timeline at @GNN_D1. Keep in mind, naming does not matter, so as per usual, please do send these into the timeline. And the other way is via an Apple Podcast review. If you rate this podcast 5 stars, it is very much appreciated. From there, you're able to fire on whatever you'd like to hear on this podcast via that 5-star review. And as I mentioned in the first segment, conference previews are coming relatively soon as we're starting to run out of a little bit of steam here with the transfer portal. So you're probably going to be getting a lot more two-part podcasts, much like you got today with tremendous guests, much like the wonderful Kevin Sweeney. So be on the lookout for that. But I'm with you guys every single day, regular season and off season on this podcast, and I'll be back with you once again tomorrow. Thank you.